the third panel of the day, third and last, so hang in there. And our moderator for Teaching Machines Then and Now is Sharon Levy of Computer Science Department, right?
Yes.
Okay, at Rutgers. So over to you, Sharon.
Thank you. So I'm happy to introduce this third panel of the day. And I will now introduce the panelists. I'll work from here. So, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So first we have Kyle Jones. He's an associate professor in the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering at Indiana University, Indianapolis. His research focuses on information ethics and policy issues associated with educational data mining and analytic practices, such as learning analytics within American higher education institutions. His research has been featured in national and international news outlets like the Washington Post and on NPR. Next, we have Dr. Elizabeth Sylvan. She is a globally recognized educational leader whose work is grounded in the fields of HCI and the learning sciences. Her lifelong interest is in socio-technical systems that support creativity, shared knowledge, and learning. She currently serves as a senior fellow at ITS Rio, visiting lecturer in the School of Engineering at Brown University, lecturer in the School of Politics and Public Policy at the Technical University of Munich, and senior director at the Secretariat of the Global Network of Internet and Society Research Centers. Finally, we have John Burmeister. He is an assistant professor of philosophy at University of Mount St. Vincent. His research interests are in philosophy of technology, philosophy of computing, philosophy of mind, and German idealism, with relevant publications including Education for a Post-Work Society, AI, the Liberal Arts, and the Future of Leisure. Thank you for joining us. And I don't know if we wanted to follow the order that we have, or you can.
Yes, if we follow our order, John is first, but is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. So let's see if this works. Yes. Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the organizers for all of the hard work that goes into this. In my presentation, I'm going to give, I guess, a little bit more optimistic or positive presentation on artificial intelligence than some of the other presentations, but I'm very open to pushback if I'm being too cheerful about this. Yeah, please bring it on at the end if that's appropriate. So my talk is called Generating Possibilities Now and Reasons Later, ? AI and Academic Research. And probably many people are familiar with this image of the centaur. It's been used for many years in terms of human AI collaboration. And we know that in some domains, this kind of hybrid creature of humans working with artificial intelligence is superior than an AI working alone or a human working alone. So this is true, or at least I don't know if it's still true, but it was true a year or two ago in chess, that a human working with a computer would beat any human or any computer in chess. The same is true in detecting breast cancer. So I'm interested in how far this metaphor of the centaur can go in terms of academic research, whether this is at the undergraduate level, graduate level, or above. I should note that Microsoft Copilot was the creator of this image, or I guess we should say co-creator. So I guess in terms of this image, which I admit is kind of creepy, I am the top half and Copilot is the bottom half. So the question is, can we minimize the weaknesses of LLMs, large language models, and can we integrate their strengths into how we do research? So weaknesses of LLMs are pretty obvious. I won't go through all 4 of them, but LLMs don't really have a point of view. This has come up a couple times today, which I think is great. Whenever ChatGPT says this is a kind of falsehood. There is no point of view that a large language model has. It's not sentient. It's not conscious. So in a way, the reason I'm mentioning this is that I think the very word hallucination is kind of misleading. I think this was come up. I think it was probably some people in technology that came up with this. So to hallucinate is to perceive an illusion to be real. To perceive something, you have to be an I or a self, and an LLM is not doing that. So I like to think of them as generative falsehoods as opposed to hallucinations, but take your pick. So why so many generative falsehoods? Well, one reason is that LLMs don't know how to reason about the world. They don't know how to grasp cause and effect. They are not doing really much of anything like what we're doing. I mean, at least at the high level. It's quite possible that LLMs are doing some things at the statistical level that our brains are doing in terms of perception, but I'll leave that for neuroscientists to figure out. But at the high level, they're not reasoning in terms of causes and effects. So it makes sense that they are churning out hallucinations because they're not really thinking about the world causally. So what are the strengths? Well, one of the strengths of an LLM is it can generate all of these different lines of inquiry with incredible speed. I mean, it's just insane the way you can put something into Claude or ChatGPT, and it's almost, sometimes it feels like before you've even hit enter, it is giving you 500 words that you could never have thought of. So this is amazing. I like to think of this as rapidly and widely exploring semantic and conceptual spaces. Or in other words, exploring possibilities. And these are possibilities in terms of, from the point of view of the technology, or rather what the technology is doing is it's doing next word prediction, as we know, based on statistical models. And that's a way of exploring conceptual spaces. So here is our large language model in a lonely quest for possibilities. And there's just millions and millions of ways you could go in researching. The example that maybe we can talk about later would be trying to figure out what's going on, like the neurological underpinnings of autism in terms of hemispheric function. What's the left hemisphere doing? What's the right hemisphere doing? If we understand the hemispheric functions better, does this tell us something about what's going on with autism? There's so many ways you could explore this, and a large language model can present some of those possibilities. Okay, so in sum, present-day large language models are less like actuality machines telling the truth, and they're more like possibility machines. They're presenting us with what might be, but not necessarily with what is. And I think that's something I try to constantly keep in mind. We do see this just in these consumer-facing models. I don't know if this is, I think this has been taken down recently, but in Copilot, we see that there's a tension between, you can have it be more creative or you can have it be more precise. And so the way I think about that is it could be more actual or more possible, giving you something closer to actuality, or it could be giving you something farther away from actuality, but giving you many more possibilities of what could be the case. So those do seem to stand in inverse relationship to each other, at least with some of the current models. So what we want to do is we want to use the strengths of large language models, sort of bottom half of the centaur, those robotic legs. It can explore this vast space of possibilities in terms of where you might go with your research, how do we actually make good use of this and move towards something like this, but minus the creepy hair.
Best part.
So here's one option. We might be able to harness large language models by, first of all, obviously you prompt them in a certain way, intelligently prompt them to generate different kinds of possibilities of how you might answer a question. And then in our second step, we use our own, at this point, uniquely human skills, rational skills, to analyze the different possibilities it presents to us, and weed out the weaker possibilities. So we're able to use logic, we're able to use symbolic logic, we're able to use language in a way that large language models do not. And specifically, we can use language in a way that maps onto causes and effects. And we're not just doing next word prediction. I mean, I think we are doing some next word prediction. Like when I'm talking to you right now extemporaneously, I'm not consciously choosing every single word. That would be exhausting. So there, my brain is doing some next word prediction, and I sort of have an idea of what I want to say to you, and then a lot of the words just tumble out. So I think there is something LLM-like, or rather I should say, LLMs are doing something like what the brain is doing, because we don't consciously choose every single word. So we're doing something like that, but we're also able to analyze things causally. Okay, step 3, we want to prompt the LLM to generate new lines of inquiry in terms of those possibilities that we have kept in our little bucket. We've thrown out a bunch of the less useful lines of inquiry, and then we say, hey, give us more information about where I might go with this possible mode of explanation. And you do this over and over and over. So this is actually already being done by some chemists in terms of producing certain molecules for therapeutic or medical purposes. So protein design and modeling. This is some language from the abstract here. Protein language models have already been trained to accurately predict protein properties, generate novel functionality. We propose our perspective on how LLMs will affect protein modeling and design. And we can also think about other technologies like DeepMind's AlphaFold, which is really revolutionizing constructive forms of like pharmaceuticals. Okay, but that's like obviously a very narrow use case where you're looking at a million different possible ways of creating a chemical, and then the large language model narrows it down to, let's say, 50, and then you can test those 50 in the lab. I mean, that's awesome, but could we generalize that approach to other disciplines? For me, that's kind of the dream. So what I would like to see happen eventually is that we can make discipline-specific large language models. And because that's really what's going on back here with what these chemists are doing. I mean, it's a very specifically trained large language model for protein design. So could we create something like that for mathematics, for philosophy, for literature, for sociology? I think we can. How would we do that? Well, we need to have super high quality data that is specific to that discipline. I mean, we don't want somebody to be doing research in like biotechnology on a model that's drawing some of its data from Reddit. Like that would be bad. Or from any other random place on the internet. We want it to be really high quality data that it's been trained on. And we also want the model to respond to the expert in expert level language. I mean, so, you can prompt the LLM, like, talk to me like I'm an expert, but, you shouldn't have to do that every time. There should be models that are designed to do that automatically. In terms of how else we could create these discipline-specific LLMs, I'd love to hear thoughts that you all have about that. We could talk about that in the Q&A, but these are just two initial sort of criteria that I thought of. And I'd love to also hear in the Q&A whether you think this is even a good idea. Maybe you think it's stupid and not worth pursuing. But I would love to have something like this in philosophy to, I can already ask ChatGPT or Claude or Microsoft Copilot to make comparisons between Descartes and Socrates, and it can do some interesting stuff. But that's just trained on pretty, massive but random amounts of data. Okay, so how am I doing on time here? Okay. Part 2 is, so we talked about generating possibilities now, and let's talk about generating reasons later. Could LLMs eventually actually incorporate reasoning about causes and effects? So one of my favorite people, Aristotle, describes science as knowledge of causes. And this is what it is to understand something, is you understand, like, to understand what a chair is, you understand its causes. I mean, he famously talks about 4 causes: formal, material, efficient, and like final. We don't need to talk about that, but basically you need to have to understand anything at all, human being, a chair, why your child is misbehaving, you need to understand all of the causes that contributed to the thing existing that you want to understand. And so in his book called The Metaphysics, he sketches this out. And there's this really interesting passage in the Metaphysics, book Alpha, first chapter. It kind of sounds like he's describing large language models. So he says, people of experience know that a thing is so, but they do not know why. While the others, those who are more wise, also know the why and the cause. Thus, we think also that the master workers in each craft are more honorable and know in a truer sense and are wiser than the manual workers, because the master workers know the causes of things that are done. By contrast, we think that the manual workers are like certain lifeless things that they do act, but they act without knowing what they do, as fire burns. So fire burns, it doesn't know why it's burning, it just burns. Thus, we view the master workers as being wiser, not in virtue of being able to act, but in virtue of knowing the causes. So we could imagine somebody making somebody working on an assembly line in a manufacturing plant. They are really good at putting this particular piece onto the car, but they don't necessarily know what it does or why it's there, how it fits into the causal structure of a functional car. And in a way, they're acting like an automaton, which is why it's easier to automate them. And now we have machines putting that piece right into place. And likewise, just like the person who lost their job to the machine also doesn't understand the causes in terms of how this piece that it's placing onto the car functions in terms of the whole, but it doesn't need to. That's the point. The master worker is the one who, I don't know, probably some combination of the person who designed the car and then the person who set up the plant to have this assembly line create a car that functions. So yeah, it feels kind of like ChatGPT and Copilot are this way. They're doing things, but they don't understand what they're doing. And we all do that all the time. Like, we don't understand. When I flip a light switch on, I don't fully understand what's happening between the switch. I don't understand the quantum mechanics of what's happening with the electromagnetic spectrum. I don't understand all the causes and all the whys, but I don't need to get the light come on. But obviously I could understand it by studying it enough. And a large language model at this point cannot. So it's kind of a mindless automaton. So this is sort of the speculative part of the talk. What if we could move large language models from being manual workers to master workers into grasping cause and effect? And I think that's part of what this book that Lauren and I were just briefly discussing, the book of Why, by, how do you pronounce his name?
Yuta Pearl.
Yuta Pearl. Thank you. So this is from, I think, 2018, and it's, he's a very famous computer scientist. He won the Turing Award. And as I understand it, he was one of the pioneers in thinking about computer science from a probabilistic perspective, like 25, 30 years ago, perhaps longer. And thinking about, so moving away from symbolic logic, symbolic AI, which deals with certainties, you're dealing with like pure deduction, and thinking about how computers might function in a probabilistic and statistical way. And so he was a real pioneer in that regard. I think because he's one of the pioneers of this, he's also one of the first to really realize the limitations of this approach of looking at things just from a probabilistic perspective, which that's what large language models are doing. And so he's trying to think about how computers might be taught to reason more like humans reason and to think about causes and effects. So here's another Copilot created image of a large language model that can do something more like reasoning. It can deal with symbols and symbolic logic, and it's combining what they call good old-fashioned AI, symbolic AI, which made a little bit of progress in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then really ran out of steam. Combining that with artificial neural networks, with machine learning, which is, of course, the dominant mode of artificial intelligence. If we can combine these two, we might have something more like a human being, because I suspect, based on my very limited understanding of neuroscience, that this is a lot of what we are doing as human beings. We have biological neural nets, but we also have language centers that can engage in symbolic, deductive, inferential reasoning. Okay, so sometimes this is today called neurosymbolic AI. I think I don't have time to talk about these examples very much, but this is from last year. Really impressive research. I mean, I don't understand enough of the paper to understand the paper, but I understand the abstract. And Quantum Magazine did a great video about it that helped me to understand it, just solving these very sophisticated problems that large language models, which are based on this sort of artificial neural network architecture, have no clue how to even start solving these problems. A better example of this, I think it's more accessible, is something that DeepMind put out earlier this year. Read the abstract here. It's called alpha geometry. It's a neurosymbolic system, and it's doing just this combination. So you have a neural language model, which is an artificial neural network. It's guiding a symbolic deduction engine through these different very high level geometry problems. And it was able to solve 25 out of 30 Olympiad level problems. I think before this paper, the highest score was like 10 out of 30 for an AI. This is a really interesting part later in the paper where they talk about specifically combining language modeling and symbolic engines. And I realize that kind of starts to sound similar, like language and symbols aren't these the same. But here, when we talk about language modeling, we're talking about artificial neural networks, which are just operating on this statistical probabilistic kind of method, like ChatGPT. So, and maybe some of you have seen this if you use Gemini and you ask Google Gemini to, it's like, what's 7 plus 12? And it'll give you some crazy response. Like, why is the most sophisticated, one of the most sophisticated AIs in the world can't do something that your calculator from 1983 could do? It's because it's not designed to do that. I mean, Gemini, ChatGPT, they're not designed to do math. They're not designed to do deductive logic. They are designed to operate in a probabilistic way. So what's really interesting about this paper is that the language model, the artificial neural network, and the symbolic deduction engine take turns. So they have this collaboration. And we see this here. You've got this very, very simple geometry problem, which even I can follow. And there in the red boxes, you can see first, there's a symbolic deduction that goes on, and then it passes it off to the language model, and you can see the artificial neural network there with the artificial neurons, doing their things. And there's a sort of loop between the deduction and the neural network, and it's able to solve the problem. And then you've got this Olympiad level problem, which makes me deeply afraid and brings back all sorts of terrible memories from high school. But I mean, just look at the complexity of this. It's kind of bonkers. Okay, so can large language models be developed that really that synthesize what they're doing with probabilities with rational, symbolic, causal forms of thinking? Definitely people are trying. This news story is from a couple days ago. If you follow this stuff obsessively, like I should not be doing, then you've been hearing about Strawberry for a while. And it is supposedly a large language model that incorporates reasoning into the model. So I wrote this slide yesterday. I don't know why OpenAI didn't just like hurry up and release it so that I could give this presentation. But I checked my phone at lunch and they did. So I added this slide just recently. This is just from a couple hours ago. OpenAI releases, I guess they're calling it 01, or I guess it's 01, or I don't know if it's 01. Yeah, 01. So they're pitching it as the first model with reasoning abilities. And we'll have to see what it can do. But the idea is that they're trying to create something like a neuro-symbolic model, which has the strengths of both of those kind of architectures, but combined into one. So that's my presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Full screen. Do you have the remote? Fabulous. Go for it.
Looks like it works. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. This has been an excellent use of time for me. I hope it's been an excellent use of time for you all too, and to our lovely people online who are listening in and probably having their own lovely conversations online. Thank you for your presence. It's been a day of engagement for me, of education, moments I've been scared, which I didn't expect to have that emotion, but here we are. That's what happens when you talk about futuristic scenarios and realistic scenarios where things become simple. I'm going to talk about something that, yes, will involve AI, because otherwise, why would I be here? But I think it's really important, in part because of my background, to talk about the infrastructure that supports AI and why we have some of the opportunities that we do have with AI. And so I'm going to be talking about AI in the context of higher education, and specifically how it possibly is going to build off of the infrastructure of learning analytics that we've been building up since around 2010. and building on the kind of maturation of affordances that we have with learning analytics. I come from this or to this from a lot of different academic angles. I do some critical data studies work on learning analytics. I do some more traditional information policy work on LA because I am an LIS researcher. I do some information privacy focused work, primarily coming from a contextual integrity background, mixed in with my LIS tradition focused on like intellectual privacy and the value of academic freedom in the context of higher ed. And from an empirical background, I've spent many years asking stakeholders in higher ed, students, advisors, faculty, librarians, instructional designers, sometimes administrators, what does it mean? What does student privacy mean in the context of higher ed? What do you value in terms of your work practices with these tools that use learning analytics or have learning analytics built into them? And what are your expectations for the tools use now and in the future so that we can align their design and their in the policy that governs them with your expectations and your kind of micro context within higher ed. So I'm going to try to bring some of these things together into a nice thread here to provide you a bit of an education on learning analytics in higher ed. If you're not familiar, or if you are familiar, which I believe you're very familiar, maybe this will be redundant, but I think there's something to be said here. So my outline, just briefly, we're going to talk about learning analytics and data doubles and some kind of theoretical frameworks here that I pull on before moving into what I think is the new socio-technical imaginary of higher education that does involve learning analytics, and how that socio-technical imaginary is changing or could possibly change in a futurized scenario with artificial intelligence and chatbots. And end with just some concluding thoughts, which are phrased in questions, as I think is the format. We all end our slides with questions and not too many answers, but mine are definitely questions. So understanding learning analytics and data doubles. So learning analytics is an academic field. It started in about 2010, and it was defined by George Siemens as the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners in their contexts for purposes of understanding and optimizing learning in the environments in which it occurs. And a lot of people in the field have translated this into many different or towards many different outcomes. And some people who are all in on learning analytics will say, give me all the data we can get from any data source on campus, from any sensor on campus, from any information technology over which we govern and have the right to access data and information born from that system. Let's analyze it. Let's find out information about our students. Let's try to predict future outcomes. Let's try to intervene in their processes, both educational and behavioral, so that we can, nudge them towards certain outcomes that we think, we being the institution, are valuable. So not everybody believes that kind of widespread view of learning analytics, but that is definitely one that is out there and it is dominant, and especially was dominant in the mid-2010s about learning analytics. So I like to point out that learning analytics is a socio-political and socio-material phenomenon, and this is from Parada and Williamson. And Williamson, I think, especially does excellent work in this space if you're interested. And they say that this process of socio-material co-construction is the result of ontological and epistemological negotiations taking place across heterogeneous networks of people, organizations, technologies, and analytic techniques. And their point here is that none of this work is neutral. None of this work is necessarily objective, but there are politics involved that are pushing the creation of these technologies and adoptions of these technologies in the context of higher education. Learning analytics is also a form of governance. Again, a Williamson quote here, but he says that education governance is being enacted through new kinds of digital policy instruments, meaning that the selection, adoption, and implementation of tools like learning analytics are used to affect a certain political outcome. That they are used to kind of mold higher education into a form that may not be agreed upon by everyone, but those with power who have us use these tools would suggest that this is the way that higher education should work. And no longer is learning analytics just the side project by some learning scientists. This is a very popular, very mainstream academic field supported by technology companies who also have advanced the field with their creation of new tools and new analytics and new systems. Many of us use a learning management system, I assume, to conduct our courses. Even though those courses may be face-to-face, usually our institutions require us to have a course site already built for us. I teach completely online. And so all of my students interact in the LMS at my institution, which is Canvas, and those analytics are built straight in. I can't turn them off. I can't have my students opt out of them. I can't opt out of them. There's no one I can talk to where I can say, please delete this from Canvas. It just won't happen. But that quantification of my students and also of me is happening. And learning analytics is making students into and treating them as data. And here, myself and my collaborator, Chase McCoy, who is at IU Bloomington, really pulled on the idea of a student being made into a data double, which is made into the synthetic data set that continually is revised as the student interacts with different information systems and as others represent that data in a data set and combine it with other data sets, and it develops a documentation of a student's life, which is then quantifiable and calculable. So what is this new socio-technical imaginary of higher education? So if you're not familiar with that term, that comes from Jasanoff and Kim, who say that collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. So new socio-technical systems which have the momentum and have the stabilized processes and affordances start to, I don't want to say constrict and control, but sometimes they do, but they form the way that we interact in a social sphere. And so we're seeing that happen in higher education, where learning analytics is a new socio-technical imaginary, whereby how we go about teaching our students or advising our students with advising analytic systems, or calculating and predicting certain types of enrollment patterns in campus or on campus starts to define how we do our work. It starts to push us to practice higher education as a faculty member or a staff member in a particular way. And it also pushes student behaviors to comport themselves with the analytics that we find to be useful and powerful. But a social imaginary may be one person's lovely reality, but it may be a very unwelcome reality for others of us in higher education. And I think it leads to some very critical questions, many of which I'm sure you're already thinking in your own head, which are what are the consequences of pursuing, running, and acting on learning analytics? So who wins and who loses in this type of social imaginary? Who benefits and who is harmed? How are those benefits spread about and into what groups within higher education? And how are, I guess I've talked about all of those different types of benefits and harms. So yeah, distributions, who benefits, who is harmed, and what are the particularized benefits and harms? So let's move into learning analytics and AI chatbots. So we have a better understanding, I think, in that very brief introduction to learning analytics, that these systems exist, that we understand the information and communication technology infrastructure within our higher education institutions is fairly ubiquitous. We can't escape from it. It's a required part of participating both as a student and as a faculty member, and to many extents as a staff member in higher education. To have an email, to get on the Wi-Fi, to pass through different sensors, to have our personally identifiable information put into different databases for different purposes, and so on and so forth. As I've argued in a couple of different papers, I don't know if there's any other system, at least in America, or socio-technical system that is more surveillant than American higher education, just because student life is so easily captured on our universities, in our systems, and how it's so requisite, excuse me, to participating in higher ed. So I want to bring your attention to this life cycle of learning analytics that's been adjusted to include generative AI. And the generative AI starts in that red circle, but it ends up in the blue one. So on the blue one is all about the learn, but really it starts in the green one with the data. So how is the data created? How is it captured? Then it moves on to that orange circle where it becomes analyzed in a variety of different ways. And then the interventions happen, because in higher education, what's the point of analyzing student data if we're not going to do something about it to somehow affect a certain type of outcome related to their learning experiences? And then once those interventions are created, they go to the learner, of course, because we want them to change their behaviors or access different resources or have different experiences that can improve their learning or just their engagement in higher ed. And this is where I think things get really tricky and where I'm very scared. I'm of the opinion that higher education is important because of the interpersonal relationships that we create with our students as faculty members, as advisors, as staff, so on and so forth, as librarians, that through those interpersonal relationships, that's how learning occurs. That's where it's most valuable. And if you introduce an AI chatbot into the important aspects of higher education, learning in the classroom or learning online or through those advising conversations that you have with professional advisors or through having those one-on-one experiences at the reference desk, then those interpersonal relationships are devalued. And they're less than, or at least at this point, I think that they would be less than. And if you devalue those interpersonal relationships among faculty, staff, librarians, and others, then those professional positions aren't valued as much in terms of their labor, right? Which then brings up questions about what would happen to certain types of positions on campus. So the chatbot to me in higher ed is the most concerning feature. We're getting into slides here where I think we've already covered many of these topics, perhaps not outside of this, not inside of this context of higher ed though. We know that students are already using chatbots. That was not necessarily the case with learning analytics. That took many years before it actually got, in the face on a dashboard for students to see. We know institutions are purchasing their own licenses of AI to analyze their own institutional data. And we know that faculty, including myself, are using AI for their own research purposes, or as I'm trying out to summarize and analyze student responses in my online courses. And we're also aware of the common issues. I don't have hallucinations 4 times, but that is correct. We know that they ingest personally identifying information and that there's some bias and prejudice involved there. So we have some questions, is this what we want for higher education? I brought this up in a question earlier. Are we going to limit access to novel uses of AI, or are we going to go all in and try to figure this out? Are we going, as I mentioned earlier, are we going to replace certain types of staff positions or professional positions because we feel like, we've created the right specialized model or that the AI chatbot is good enough, even though it may not be as good as a professional position? Are we going to put up our hands and say, well, student privacy issues should block the uses of AI because they ingest personally identifiable information? Or are we going to be willing to give up our students' lives based on the data sets that we have so that we can feed the LLMs and help drive the chatbot? And will AI be used as a tool of power to study, shape, and control the curriculum, which I think is really important too, because the more we have access to especially in learning management systems where everything is so datafied in terms of their interactions and their grades and their participation, are we going to use analytics and other AI tools to kind of shape and control the curriculum, which should be in the power of the faculty? So some remaining slides here. Learning analytics might be able to teach us about data doubles, right? The literature is ripe with good ethics articles about students and student privacy. And what I know about students and my empirical research suggests that they're willing to provide information, private information to their institution if they benefit from the analytics. So it might go as far to suggest that they'd be willing to provide information to LLMs if they're going to benefit from the chatbots. Students were primarily unaware of how their institutions use data about themselves when I asked them. And I think the same is likely to be said for AI. I think we've done a very poor job in higher education of being transparent, which I know is just the start, but being transparent about our practices and then providing an authentic way for them to provide input back to the governance actors in higher ed to create really relevant policies that respect their preferences. And with regard to benefits, we already know that students feel like they're benefiting. Maybe they're benefiting in the wrong way or the ways that we wouldn't want them to benefit by using AI in our courses, but they're doing it without much, if any, pedagogical guidance. And I'm very scarred for life by a conversation I had with my niece about how she used AI to generate an essay, got an A on it, and I just dropped my mouth like, come on, you can do better than that. But I don't blame her that much because she hasn't been, she hasn't had the literacy training on, the downsides of that, or the pedagogy wasn't there to give her the framework to be successful with AI while not reducing her critical thinking skills. And learning analytics might be able to teach us about information sensitivity. They do want some limitations placed on how their information is used and who gets to use it, but it's really unclear how our institutional policies will adjust in this world of AI. And if the law will ever, especially with regard to student privacy, will ever adjust to give them the protections they need. And just finally here, students don't trust third parties, but they generally do trust their institutions, but AI is primarily a third-party tool. So how will we create walled gardens that protect them and walled gardens that they can trust in? So just the final thoughts here, I'm not sure how to go about this. I don't have any best practices yet. I think we're starting with conversations like this to create a community where we can develop those best practices. I don't think we have an understanding yet about the contextual norms and values that we hold true will align with AI use or come counter to those things, but that's for research to figure out. But I do know that AI will require some fast and purposeful responses from all stakeholders in higher education, not just our administrators, not just the faculty, not just the librarians. It's a community problem. Thank you.
On to Liz Sylvan. Oops. To figure out how to get into full screen. Oops. Okay. Does that work with the clicker?
It works with the clicker.
Fabulous.
Okay. This is a great panel to be part of. The whole day has been great. What I'm going to say actually relates very, very well to what John and Kyle have just talked about. I'm a learning scientist and an HCI researcher by training. I am not a librarian and I am not a historian, although today I will be making references to some things that happen in history. That more is because I've studied the topics, not because I'm an expert in the history of these topics. Generally, right now I'm teaching about critical thinking in the time of generative AI. I'm developing informal education programs and exhibits where the general public can understand socio-technical issues. And I do some work in public policy, international public policy, particularly as it relates to technology and education. So I'm going to talk about educational chatbots. We've been talking about those for a bit. I want to just name a couple things about what they are composed of because it's going to be relevant later, even though we've talked about it now before. So they use generative AI and through natural language processing. So they talk to you, right? They're conversational to provide information. We've talked about information versus knowledge before on educational subjects and to provide feedback to students as they learn. And they are largely, if not entirely, commercial products. So the gorilla in the room is Conmigo, but there are a number of other ones that we've talked about today, right? And they look something like this, as we know. You ask a question, they give an answer, they try to make it a little conversational. They sometimes seem like you're having a conversation, and sometimes it's sort of like they're reciting a textbook with a question at the end, as is happening here. And this is something that, ed tech is investing in. There's this sort of like huge by ed tech standards market. And we know we've talked a lot about today, all day, and also in this panel, the way academia is investing in it. But it's also something that has the government of the US and other countries behind it. So this is a screenshot of a report from the Department of Education, the Office of Educational Technology, that came out, I don't remember, this year, does it say there? Last year. Last year. It's actually a really interesting read, and and I'll come back to that in a little bit. It also, as it's being marketed, it's been marketed as a tool for everyone. It's supposed to help everyone in a kind of generalized way. As we know, it's something that's also been very hyped. It's very new. It's about the future. We're welcome to the new age. It's revolutionizing. It's transforming, which is all great. But what's really going on there? And I want to call our attention to this idea of particularly to the idea of tutoring. Because that is a very common sort of key comparison that we make when we say it's better than or equal to something else. We're either saying it's better than nothing, or it's better than a big old classroom where the teacher's doing everything the same way, or it's better than small group instruction, or it's better than this high dose tutoring. So, the sort of intensive, like there's a person working with you very, very closely. Okay, so the gold standard of what we over time had wanted to, sorry, I did not advance that slide, so you saw what I was talking about. High dose tutoring. That's become, whether it should or not is a question, but that has become really like what we're trying to shoot for. Can we be as good as a human tutor? And that's really the question. Can we be as good as a human tutor? Well, let's start by looking back at how we got here. So I actually loved that this panel is about teaching machines, because that's actually where I'm going to start. So teaching machines was something that started in the 20s, and these like mechanical computers basically that kind of did a call and response, and if you made a mistake, it would kind of reset to a different path. And it was something that was very inspiring to B.F. Skinner, who continued this work. Starting in the 40s, published this in the 50s. I've put two things together in this image. So this is not the image that goes with the paper, although it maybe looks like it the way this is presented. But the point here is, one, that this has its roots, its foundation in behaviorism. Behaviorism was a sort of development that came out of multiple things, but in part, a response to psychoanalysis and the idea of really studying the individual. And it was the idea of, can we create environments like, the Skinner boxes with rats and pigeons, where we reinforce certain kinds of learning through positive and negative reinforcement. And you might note that this is some of the same language that we've been using as we've been talking about the neural networks on which our very tools of today are built. So this is the 50s, but in some ways, this is exactly what we're talking about. And I don't know if you can see the print there, but it says the purpose is self-instruction. So again, we're thinking already about replacing the teacher with a better tutor. Okay. So from there, and I could have covered a lot of different things that happened in the development of this technology, and I'm just kind of covering two. And the first is really about, out of behaviorism grew this idea of cognition and the idea we're going to reinforce different things to get people to think, to have the knowledge and information that we want them to have. And we're going to do this by reinforcing certain things. And if they make a mistake, we're going to correct them and put them back on the path of the steps that we know work. And that gets me to my first of two historical research areas. And again, I'm jumping time here, of intelligent tutoring systems and cognitive tutors. And so the idea of an intelligent tutoring system is you have something that's going to have a model about what the user wants and some other things that'll talk, or what the learner is trying to learn, or what the system is trying to teach is probably a better way to put it, the learner. And you have tutors that are these agents that are no different in some ways than the chatbots today, although they have evolved of yesterday. And the a canonical, if not the canonical example of this, of cognitive tutors, is this Act R, which, if you go Google that and you kind of do like a model, you'll see something that looks a lot like some of the models that actually, it doesn't look entirely unlike the model that Kyle showed earlier. Yours had more color and it was round instead of rectangles, but that was probably because we didn't really make rectangles and color quite the same way then. And to underline the importance of this work, and I could not recreate this, but I know it to be true, but I could not find a nice image to represent it. John Anderson was the most cited computer scientist in the period in the 80s and 90s. So not like learning scientist or guy doing cognitive tutors, but actual computer scientist. So this is a huge body of work that impacted many, many, many things. Okay, so let's move to the next slide and see. Oh, it's showing them backwards. Okay, so it doesn't like my slides. Okay, so this is the Commodore 64 1983 version of a cognitive tutor that I got off archive.org, Internet Archive. And you can use it, they have an emulator. So unfortunately, I can't move my slides around there. But you go and you say, and it trains you in this really smart way on how to be someone who is getting learning reinforced in the system. It says, you're in the system, you need to type things very precisely. First, type your name. And of course, if you make a mistake in your name, it's not going to it doesn't really matter to the system. So it's like a little bit of practice, a little trial. And then, it says, if you type anything wrong, you start over again, which is how these systems worked for a long time, into the early 90s at least. So again, we don't make students do this anymore, but in some ways, the structures are exactly the same. Okay, so I think it's because maybe I can't, I wonder if you, no, you can't do it either. Okay, no, it's all right. We'll go to the next slide. So this is what the models used to look like. And I want to take a little beat on this because these models and the models that you see in AI and that underline the modern technologies that we have now. Oh, thank you. That's the wrong one. Well, this one. Thank you. Are actually, again, based on the same foundation. So at the same time that people were developing cognitive tutors, it was very meta. They were also developing the models of the students, the cognitive models. They were developing it was all written in Lisp. This is so Lisp. It was all, they were creating models of what experts learned. So this is all the chess study research, all grew out of this. They were creating models of how the system should work. So, and they were developing AI models. So these are neural networks. Okay. Now, I'm making this sound very kind of strict and orderly, and just to sort of demonstrate that projects in time are not simply linear and orderly. I just want to do a beat on not everything looked this way. So there was a sense that, there was more than what's happening in the head. This is a picture of Seymour Papert with his turtle, which is in a machine that would draw on a page, and it was used very socially. And so there was a sense even then that, we aren't just these boxes, in our heads walking around, that we actually had a physical experience, and that learn that cognition is situated in a context. And this body of work grew into the visual programming language world of Scratch and similar technologies. All right. So I happily don't need to cover everything I was thinking about covering with learning analytics. Oh, okay. Which I have labeled there adaptive learning. I mess with my slides more. So we'll see how these line up. So when I was talking about those earlier technologies, there was commercialization, but there was a closer mapping between commercialization and the academics who were developing the fundamental theory. And what we see, and a historian could talk about this much more accurately, so I am reporting on my experience as a practitioner and as academic, not as someone who is a historian, but sometime around, I would say the 90s, there started to be this bifurcation where the evolution of the commercial market started to take over in a way that was disconnecting from the academic market, which is totally what we see today. Think about that slide I had in the beginning about who's developing the chatbots. Okay, so then we had these learning management systems we talked about. We had MOOCs. MOOCs were going to save the world. Open educational resources. I still believe in all of these things, by the way, even if I'm being a little sarcastic. I still think that there's a lot of great ideas here. They looked like things like this. They actually still do, maybe not so much the MOOC part, but certainly Google for Education. And what we start to see here is instead of specialized companies that are for education, we see there's always been this case to a certain extent, but we see these sort of like mass market plays. Apple did do it in the 60s, 70s, and 80s too. But we see this mass market play that I think is really descriptive of what's happening today. There's a bit of a terminology mismap between what Kyle was talking about and what I'm talking about. Forgive me for doing this, but I'm just going to say that learning analytics and educational data modeling are very, very similar conceptually, which not everyone would agree with. But they're bridging these things, education, statistics, computer science, and computer-based education in a way that is not fundamentally different, or the foundation is the same as when we were talking about the Skinner period. Let's see if these are the same. Okay, skip that. So, so what do we see in these technologies? What do we see them from the beginning, and then even more so now? We see that they're personalized. We see that they're self-paced. They provide some kind of immediate feedback, and that they're purported to have the advantages of human tutors or classroom teams, small groups, without the same cost. Now, when you look at the investment that's being made, you can make an argument that actually there's quite a bit of money being put into it that you might put into teachers. But let's just put that aside as we do. Now I'm in so that's sort of like what's happening in the world. And, I glossed over or didn't mention entire fields of the learning sciences. So just please, that's painful for me. So I just want to acknowledge it. But I think Kyle got at this a little bit. But one of the things that what this means is that theory matters even more now. So you can look for significance, or effects in large quantities of data and find it. And they could be spurious, right? They could just be things that are happening because you get enough data and then you see something happening. But what you really need to be thinking about is, what do you understand about from learning science, which, as I mentioned, we can say started at different times, the 1950s, the 1980s, the 1990s. I don't know what time period you prefer to start it, but you could go back to Babbage. I mean, you could do a lot of different things, but it's been going on for a while, and we know, and we made major investments, number one computer scientist for whatever that was, 10, 20 years. We know something already. Let me skip that. So one of the things that we know, so this is point 2 of 3, that we really need to have a detailed model of the learner. What we have sometime in these tools, so remember I sort of like showed you that thing that was from a model of like what an expert knows and how an expert should talk to a non-expert, the learner, and you have a learner model. And we don't have any of that, or we have very limited amounts of that in the commercial tools. And we really don't know what is being modeled because it's commercial, so it's not open. And there's also a lot of other things we should be modeling and knowing about. So, and again, Kyle got at a bunch of this. What's their cognitive state right now? What's the room that they're in? How does their body feel? What's their metacognition? What's their understanding about what they're understanding? We don't have any of that. And we don't have also any academics who can access that, which is just a problem with data in general. It's the same problem that's happening more broadly, but it's also a problem here. Now, one of the things that used to drive me crazy about these kinds of models, when they were these models, cognitive models and models of what the learner understands, is that they are only a model. So they are not reality. And it's really hard to remember that when you are trying to work on a system that helps a student or even helps you get published. So it's important to have a detailed learner model, and it's also to remember humility about that model, to know that it is not the truth. It is an estimation of what's happening, and it might look like it might have the right reaction times, response times, error rates, but that doesn't mean it's actually modeling what's going inside, which actually gets at a bit what John, you were talking about as well. So I want to follow up on this learner model with one other idea, which is, again, getting back to this piece that the Office of EdTech put out. And it's about modeling learner strengths. So traditionally, these models are about modeling where they make mistakes and getting them back on the path. And that's a deficit model. And a deficit model in modern times sounds negative for its own sake. And, maybe not good for the ego or something like that, which is real. And the other problem is that it doesn't say what the student is bringing to the situation, which is, a whole bunch of things about their interests, that all the sort of classroom stuff that we've been talking about all day today. So I'm glad that this is being noted in it's part of the recommendations that's going to have nationwide impact. Education isn't just a bunch of discrete lessons. I think we've covered this today pretty well. So the deeper understanding comes from the context that we've been talking about all day. Most recently, Kyle was talking about. But I want to talk about, go a little bit into another related issue, which is acculturation. So this is, you understand how to be part of something, whether it's a learning environment or a human interacting with other humans in physical space by being part of a classroom. And, it's how we know how to approach one another. And if we are kind of interacting with bots a lot, which is fine, don't object to bots, we may decide that it's okay to talk to one another the way we talk to bots. And that is kind of a breakdown we're seeing more broadly being reported on, mostly, I think, anecdotally. And I also think there's something there about attention, because we are all often very distracted, students included. It's useful when the classroom can be kind of a sacred space where that doesn't happen. And when we are doing discrete lessons that are a little more than TikTok, but still kind of not giving the bigger conceptual piece, we're not getting at that sort of broader attentional strength that we hope learners and humans bring to their lives. All right, so maybe O1 is going to totally fix this problem. We just found out about it today, so wait and see what happens tomorrow. But it's still really hard to model what students don't understand, like what's going wrong when they don't understand something. One, so we've talked about that. It's also hard to model conceptual understanding and then to know how to intervene. And this does relate to the last point of discrete lessons. But if what we think people need to know going forward, we're all ending with questions, so no one's confident about this, but is the ability to synthesize and really do the kind of problem solving, creativity kind of work that only O1 can do. We need to be, and these systems aren't teaching that, and we're relying on them as teachers. Maybe we're not using them the right way. So what's my answer here to the question of is history repeating? I don't think it's quite repeating, but there's definitely a pattern that's repeating. And we're at a different moment, and we should acknowledge that. But knowing the history of what's been happening, bringing that history into the modern ed tech development, or not, I don't know, could be a really important and powerful thing. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Full presentations. So now we have some time for Q&A, and I think I'll get us started with the first question. So this is a question mainly for Elizabeth and Kyle. So we're discussing the development of AI tools for educational purposes, but one thing to keep in mind is that people learn differently. Some people are visual learners, some people are auditory learners, some people do well with a lot of positive reinforcement. So is there a bias or a difference in the way that new and old educational technologies are being created, where they may benefit some students and not others, and what technologies can compensate for these differences?
So if you don't have a model of a learner, you're not going to be able to do that. You're just not, because you're not going to know. I mean, there's a field of individual differences, which was simply a way of saying we want everyone to be the same, but if they're not, We're going to we're going to call that individual differences, and we're going to study that as a separate thing. I'm being a little overly simple, unfair. I'm being unfair. But that's real. So I think that's I think that's one of the hard problems, because you really do need to have a sophisticated model of the student. It has to be personalized, truly personalized, which gets into all the privacy issues. I don't think we've talked that much today about the fact that we are gathering data on kids and their learning throughout their lives and now it's not even kids, because it's been going on long enough that it's also young adults. So I don't know if I'm rooting for the good data, good learner models or not. I don't know.
Perhaps this is just simpleton thinking, but it's a chat bot, so it's text. Any chat bot that I've interacted with has never given me a video with a synthetic person lecturing to me. It's never given me an image. It's never given me a good diagram. I mean, I teach database design, and diagramming is a very big part of that, and in doing it detailed and accurately is a big part of it. And I've worked with Chat GPT to build me a database using all of the concepts that I teach my students, and it just fails on the visual part every single time, which is so key. So I don't know. I think we're biasing right now, it seems, unless I don't know the systems more widely like you do, Liz, but it's just biasing text-based learning, which I just got pinged on from one of my students the other day for giving chapters to read, you know, and articles to read. But
How dare you?
yeah, I know. Burn the library in the text, but yeah.
Can I say something about that? I was just, yeah, I mean, I haven't used Conmigo, but it's easy to imagine. And from what I understand, that was one of the first partnerships that OpenAI made. You know, Sam Altman, people have strong opinions about him either way, but maybe it was just for rhetorical purposes, but he was saying, like, I want to partner with Khan Academy as one of the first public things we do. I suspect Conmigo is going to get quite good at learning what students learn from, get better from. So, and eventually it will be multimodal. And so, you know, I've read conflicting things about whether it even makes sense to talk about different learning styles in terms of auditory and visual. And one of my friends in education was saying, no, that's all been debunked. I don't know, but regardless, people, even just in terms of examples, I mean, so like one high school student would be really interested in learning about mathematics if the examples are all about Taylor Swift. Another student wouldn't care about that at all and would be just immediately tune out. And that student wants to learn about calculating the numbers at, you know, whatever, a Yankees game, like that kind of stuff. As long as we have the proper privacy measures in place, seems like Conmigo could learn that pretty quickly. Say, okay, I use sports here, pop music here. That's exciting to me because I know, yeah, I mean, in class, I'll use certain examples and I'll see a third of the students perk up and I'll see 2/3 zone out. And it's like, okay, what if I could talk to each one of them individually and knew their interests? That would be amazing. So I'm kind of excited for that.
Thank you.
All right, we have, I'm just acknowledging that there are some questions in the chat and in the Q&A, but I'm going to pass it for now to Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was a fascinating panel. I feel like I just did stenography up here trying to keep track of what you all were saying. Liz, you could be a historian. I think you should say you're honorary historian. I think it is so critically important what you've done in sort of laying out that genealogy to really, I think, challenge the uncritical and ahistorical notion of AI hype and previously big data hype. This sort of is powering the pivot to learning analytics as some sort of like ostensibly objective and apolitical measure of something that is unmeasurable, which is teaching and learning. And I like the way you show how, yeah, the technology is new, but the social and cultural continuities remain, and you situate this longer trajectory within the broader systems of higher ed and capitalism itself. I feel like we've talked around capitalism today, but I'm not sure how many people have really said it. And one of the striking parts for me about the sort of learning analytics history is to sort of put a finer point on it. Kyle, you sort of, I think, say it up to a point, but I would, at a large public institution with a tremendously strong union and, many pitched battles over privacy, various forms of analytics, and really the corporatization of higher ed. I see learning analytics as just another tool of the corporatized university to discipline and control faculty and students, instructors and students and graduate workers all together, while eroding faculty governance over curriculum and instruction while enriching ed tech capitalists. So when I hear that, baked into Canvas is this sophisticated data dashboard that I don't really have access to, but other sort of data, I guess, analysts at the university do. I just wonder about the misuse of that kind of data, and the ways in which sort of it lends itself to the quantification and the sort of measuring of education by clicks. And so in conversation with some of the folks who are working on this at Rutgers, I said, just because someone is clicking a lot on a Canvas site doesn't necessarily mean that they're learning. And conversely, some of my most brilliant students actually spent very little time on the Canvas site. Maybe they downloaded everything they needed and they weren't back on. And I'm just so concerned about the way in which this sort of ostensibly objective suite of data dashboards is really, I think, an enormous problem for those of us who are sort of situating teaching and learning in this broader context of labor. So I'll stop ranting now, but it's your sort of take on learning analytics to me feels, dystopian is a strong word for late in the day, but it's enormously concerning.
You see, you got solidarity.
Yeah. Seems like our second microphone has crapped out, so I'm gonna have to get the one you have.
I just want to say to that, I'm so glad that you have a strong union. I come from a state where unions don't exist. I'm at an institution which is not Bloomington, so it is underfunded, where we live on our enrollments and we live on the indirect cost recoveries from our grants. And so that is privileging some schools who are able to gain access to large grant funding or have the hot, department or program, this year or in the last decade over those who have just as an important value in higher education, who don't need grants to do their work or who have low enrollment. And the analytics would just go to reinforce the negative sides of that type of neoliberal education, especially at my campus.
My question builds off of that and thinking specifically about how do we challenge these capitalist models. For the people online, hey, it's Mary Tunn speaking. I'm now, the camera is shifting. Yay. Okay. This question kind of has a couple of ingredients. The first is John's provocation of the customized model for discipline-specific interactions and supporting research. So we've had similar conversations at the U of I about how we go about building this. And the big giant roadblock is access to publisher data. That even though we have all these, we've negotiated open access publishing and these licensing agreements with the big publishers, that we still are having difficulty getting that text and data mining access that we would need to build such a system. So I'm wondering, what are the ingredients that we need in place in order to build better systems? Like, what are the kinds of institutional or funding? This is a very blue sky question, but what needs to be in place to build the ideal?
You mean the ideal, like discipline-specific LLM or
Yeah, I'm
chatbot?
thinking specifically of the discipline-specific LLMs and those kinds of pedagogical technologies. So if we were to replace Canvas, or if we were to replace Conmigo, what would be the things that would need to be in place in order to replace those?
I don't know that much about learning management systems, but yeah, I don't have a good response to that. I wonder what could be financial incentive. It seems like there would be a way to financially incentivize publishers to, I mean, just like, didn't Reddit has signed a deal with OpenAI, I believe. A lot of publishers have signed deals with OpenAI to allow OpenAI to train models on this huge trove of valuable data. Could something like that be done with publishers? Is there a way, like, it depends on how much money the resulting model make, I guess, and how much would go back to the publishers. I mean, I know, more and more scholars are publishing things on their own websites, a draft that's just like one word different from whatever they publish. So maybe as that becomes more and more popular, and publishers are squeezed more and more in terms of their financial resources, maybe they would be sort of pressured to sign some sort of, I don't know. It doesn't sound great to me, but I could see it maybe going that way, that a couple people leave OpenAI and they want to start a, discipline specific I guess they may not even be called LLMs in 10 years, but discipline specific AI research assistants. And at that point, there's enough money to be made from that for publishers to say, here's the data. That's just a guess, but I'd love to hear from you guys.
Well, just knowing what I know about scholarly publishing, the Elsevier's of the world will never give up access to their troves of articles and research, simply because that's a product that they can sell. I mean, they could create their own LLMs, create their own chatbots, I assume, given all the money that libraries provide or institutions provide them and others, to sell us another product on our own research.
So, yeah, that's interesting. So maybe it goes the other way. Maybe the power players in publishing get big enough and they start buying up other publishing houses, and then they have an internal team that creates.
I mean, educational publishing has been
might be worth it.
collapsing since the 1990s. So when you look at like what it costs to run an OpenAI versus what our very valuable scholarly contributions would be in a market, I don't think the numbers work. So I don't see that working in any way. Reddit is selling its content because it's being sucked up anyway, and they're changing their business model because they're having. So I mean, they're fundamentally okay. I think a way to do it is to do some sort of combination of. I think this is where we need legislation. One, like we just need legislation. Period. Like there's no way around it. I always like a model that avoids that when possible, but I don't see a way around it. 'cause it's really hard to do that well, and we don't know how to do it well. So that's a whole other problem. And you know, we have like really great examples of social media companies being asked for years to share data. And then Facebook, you know, like finally saying, okay, we've got this like research thing, apply, you know, and we see how that went. Um, and that was before we were ingesting the whole internet, before we have to ingest our own tail to get more data to train on. So um, the numbers don't work. Any which way, like the financial numbers don't work and the data numbers don't work. I think what maybe, actually, I'm super interested what John would think about this idea that using the larger models to kind of create smaller models that then become maybe a little more affordable. You sounds like you track things more carefully than I do. If that's a possibility, then I think we can talk about like some sort of like open source public-private partnership. I mean, OpenAI is a B Corp, right? Like, like it 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 tried in its way to with to be a different kind of company. Um, so
We'll see if it stays that way, but
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean-
currently it's run by a
It is not that way right now.
I mean, yeah.
by a nonprofit. So they don't have a fiduciary duty to maximize profits, but there are of course market pressures.
They now have an $80 billion valuation. They're asking for $150 billion valuation. And they're also, you know, they're 49% owned by Microsoft. Do you know that?
They are, so Microsoft has invested,
They,
they invested, I think, $13 billion into.
and that money's gone. That's why they're raising again.
Sure.
That money's gone. So we're talking about Microsoft, which is maybe the second largest company in the world. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. Somewhere in the top 3 or 4.
Sure.
Owns 49% stake in OpenAI, now valued at $80 billion and out of money because this technology is so expensive to run. And they will raise, they will get it again, but what they're holding out for is to double their valuation because they probably, you know, I'm sure the issue is who owns what piece.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm only mentioning that they're run by a nonprofit in terms of what they're legally obliged to do. The market forces are a separate issue for sure. In terms of larger models creating smaller models, I mean, right, you've got a lot of synthetic data, and that's part of what the paper that I talked a little bit about from DeepMind, there was synthetic data created, but that's in geometry problems. And so you could say it's not real world in the same way as other problems are, even though geometry is a part of the real world. Yeah, you do start to have problems where models creating data, they start eating themselves and the data gets less and less reliable. So I'm a little bit skeptical about the larger models creating smaller models if the larger models are not themselves trained on super high quality data. So yeah, I mean, Department of Education funding, I mean, I'm with you in terms of having the government get involved. There does seem to be, so I'm just thinking off the fly here in terms of trying to financially incentivize this. So people would have a hard time seeing it in the humanities, but almost certainly in the natural sciences. I mean, if there can be, let's just say like a biochemistry large language model that's trained on extremely valuable data and it comes from these powerful publishers. And if the publishers think, well, if we give researchers this kind of tool, they can probably come up with a way to, you know, double life expectancy, and how much money will that create? So it's all about speculating on how much money could be made from having this kind of research assistant. in the sciences, there's massive, massive money to be made.
Can I just add up? I think it's a two-part problem. One is basically the data. We have a lot of unstructured information that needs to be structured in some way to feed into a LLM, right?
Mm.
I think if we can create a model, not necessarily a large language, but a model that can read, it's like creating a small piece of software and giving it to everybody. And what it does is whatever the data you have control in, you train it over that data, and then the results are based off what you fed into it. If you connect it to, the problem with LLMs is because there's a huge cost problem to it. But with this model, we are not dependent on these big publishers. Everyone first, I think open source will have a solution to it rather than corporates, because corporates are all driven by money, right?
Sorry, I'm kind of like losing track of the Q&A here at this point. I gave the microphone to Leslie, but I don't want to break up this conversation. So Lauren, do you want to?
I don't have the microphone.
It's okay. There are actually some pickups in the ceiling of the.
Okay, can I stand up? Does everyone hear me in the chat? So this is a great conversation. I want to say that Nikki also has had her hand up for a while.
Okay.
Because I'm a blabber and talk all the time, but I'm interested in this conversation. There's a lot of different things on the table. What you have in mind, John, neurosymbolic, I think is a very, everyone thinks neurosymbolic would be great. The question is how to make it work. And hopefully there will be research, but I'm not exactly sure that that's where you're focusing on LLMs being fine-tuned with high quality data. That is not necessarily going to develop the kind of causal. In fact, there's no evidence that it will. What it would do is it would create something that is better at answering some kinds of queries about that form of data, although it might be worse at something else, right? So, the neurosymbolic, I think, is completely something that is an open question that many people would like to be working on. LLMs are utterly a paradigm to do with size, capture of resources. No one else can actually even get in because no one can run them, and exploitation of labor, not to mention environment and all the other things. I hope that universities are not going to be pursuing their dreams of education and research via LLMs, at least not alone, right? There are ways to use an LLM for what it's good at, interpreting what a person is asking, and then you switch to something like a database that actually has information or something that you really want in more the way that you need. Then there's a separate question that people might actually have research questions, not students necessarily, but like researchers might have research questions that can be answered computationally. And they want to look at those big patterns, like, for example, cancer prediction and so forth. Those don't have to be massive. They just have to have the very best data you can get and the domain experts in the loop, and hopefully other people too, like cancer patients and so forth. So these are all different things, and none of them is specifically focused on education, right? It's not clear to me that the best kinds of bots are going to be primarily LLM based. They might, as I said before, use the LLM to be able to interpret. If student is having a issue with block, it will help it get that right. But like the old-fashioned interactive systems that were made on CD-ROMs in the 90s, they got things right 100% of the time, right? It wasn't this sort of like, that Harvard duck. I don't know why they call it the duck, but the Harvard CS, Harvard CS 50. That thing was wrong 15% of the time about computer science and 30% of the time about the syllabus. So fortunately, those Harvard students are probably pretty smart. And not that many of, a lot, around 58%, something like 60% of my memories serving me thought it was useful. Probably for that reason. The textbook maker for that class could create an interactive system that would help the student to find what they want, but it's not going to be OpenAI making $1 trillion market for an answers everything machine, right? So if we want education, there are probably better ways to do it. If we want more human-like intelligence with causal inquiry, I don't think it, LLMs might be a piece, but it would be more the neurosymbolic. Educators, I think, should be thinking about, maybe public-private partnership, sure, but like we have been giving away our data now for about maybe not much more than 15 years. We used to have our own servers. We used to have our own email. Our students didn't used to be using Google Docs. Our faculty didn't used to be using Microsoft. This was all stuff that just happened. And now we're finding out, what it brought. But the good news is, these are actually older technologies. It wouldn't be absolutely easy, cheap, and fun for universities to build their own Google Docs, but it's actually completely possible. It would not, if a consortium of universities and colleges and schools had the will, we could build non-surveillance systems for our students and ourselves and our kids that allows two students to work together on a document, which is the point of Google Docs, not Google, the cradle to grave gets everybody's data. So I think we need to be thinking about a lot of different things, but I learned a huge amount from this panel, and I completely agree that, LMSs, that's another thing. We could, it's not like we need to build our own LMS because we don't need to do it, have to do all of those things. We used to hear it, right? We used to have this thing called Sakai that got kicked out, and some people didn't even think that was a good system, but it's not that hard to have a system that safely gives your student a tick to download a syllabus.
Leslie, go ahead.
Can I just respond real quick?
Sure. Okay.
So yeah, maybe it wasn't clear enough in my presentation, but part one of the presentation, which was like the generating possibilities now, was about large language models, and then how can we fine tune them through better quality data and so forth to be this research assistant possibility maker. And then part two of my presentation was generating reasons later, ? Which is a completely different architecture, as you were saying. So the neurosymbolic architecture is just different.
It doesn't exist.
Well, it does exist in that paper that I highlighted, the Deep Mind paper. So it is a neurosymbolic architecture that worked. It's better at solving super high level geometry problems than any other AI system.
What you're talking about, and I'm sorry.
So it is, but will it work for anything outside of mathematics? We don't know yet. We don't know. So
Hold my breath.
yeah, because the world of math is different than the world of physics and neuroscience. Exactly. So yeah, and we'll see what this new OpenAI thing can do. I bet it's going to be quite disappointing, but it does point towards a new kind of architecture, and we can see where it goes.
Leslie.
Yeah, I find everything being said here fascinating. I guess I have a question that I could go in so many different directions, but I'm going to try and tie to all three of you. One is, Kyle, you raised the question of like who benefits, who loses from learning analytics. And I also think along with that question goes who's who's the experiment, who gets experimented with this. So for example, ConMigo, right, was tested in Newark public schools, low performing schools, right? And you also have like with predictive analytics, something at my institution that we were wary of was that Starfish is a system that we use, and they were using predictive analytics to establish a risk score for retention, which were overwhelmingly flagging students of color and creating like next to their face a number and like a red flag that they are a risk. And, you know, John, you also raised the issue of like, oh, we could explore possibilities. And I know you were just using this as an example, but I thought it was interesting that you chose the example of autism, right? As well, we could just, maybe it's usefully wrong, right? Like maybe we could just explore possibilities, but there's a huge stake in getting that wrong, right? And whose lives are at risk when we are just kind of playing with these tools to decide, come up with research avenues. So my question to all three of you is, how do you see who is being subjected to these technologies and who ultimately, and what are the stakes of that?
I mean, just real quickly, our students have been experimental subjects for these third-party companies for years. So anytime we contract with a, you know, the Google or the Canvas or whatever the ed tech tool is, they're gaining access to data on which they're building new products and selling it back to us, but they're using our data and information about our students. Now, it may be limited to some extent, and I have never read yet of an LMS provider packaging that data and then selling it downstream to someone else. So they're not benefiting financially from a data set that they are selling into the market, but they are benefiting financially from the ability to create new products on the back of our students or to test their analytical, you know, metrics, whatever the case may be.
So it would be really great if we were able to take the concerns about data privacy out of the equation. And it's a really hard thing. We haven't solved it. But I wonder if there's a way to think about digital self-determination and the ways in which having a framework where your data serves you, where you don't mind and you are protected. And so you don't mind so much that your data is being shared, which is exactly what Kyle was saying the studies of students were indicating. I don't see how you can solve any of these issues without that. There's no educational intervention in which students are not guinea pigs. The difference is the commercialization of it. But anytime you study something in education, the way you find out if it works is you do a study. So the thing is, we're not doing studies in the same way, right? We're figuring out market opportunities. So that's different. But I wonder if what we were able to do is say, and an individual's data is not that useful. Like my data by itself is not that useful, right? So we have to come together and all be digitally self-determination and make some shared choices, which is why I suggest that the path has to be something related to regulation. And we have models for how to use data differently in other places, in how we deal with medical data. Not that that's perfect, but we do have other models that we could look into and make different choices. And I don't see, without addressing that, how you can begin to address the issues that will always come up, where the kids in Newark, the kids who are in poor performing schools, who are underachieving, will not get the AI tutor because they need more remediation to get to the same level as everyone else. And I'm, I understand that. I'm saying this descriptive, like to describe the way it's usually framed, not because I agree with how that's framed.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I wasn't sure how much time I would have, but I wish I could display my screen right now. I was thinking yesterday, like it would have been really interesting to test this theory that I'm presenting about using large language models as a research assistant on my own thesis, and just like, in other words, like write the presentation and then write it again with an LLM helping me to see if I'm just talking nonsense. But I didn't have time because I stayed up late last night finishing my PowerPoint. But in the process of doing this, I was kind of trying to test it out. So I just picked something, I'll just read a little bit of it to show you what I mean and to maybe address the concern of like, oh, I like what you raised. Like, we don't want to just like have LLMs come in and cause real damage to people. So here's just a quick example. I asked Claude, Anthropic's chatbot, what are some ways that hemispheric neuroscience research can help us understand the neurological underpinnings of autism? It gave me a bunch of different things, but it talked about local versus global processing of information, like locally within one hemisphere or between both hemispheres. And I followed up and I said, say more about the topic you mentioned of local versus global processing. What areas of research would you explore? What experiments would you construct to make progress on the origins of autism in this area? And it mentioned something called a genetic association study. So I asked it about that. How would I run this genetic association study? What resources would I need? What genetic databases would be useful to take this line of research? And it lists real databases that I'm familiar with, like at the Simons Foundation. I asked another follow-up question based on what it said about genome variants. So I said, what kinds of variants in particular would be the most relevant for me to look at, and so forth and so forth. So it's just kind of guiding me through a process, and all of the same safeguards would still be in place in terms of like if I was actually putting people in fMRI machines and so forth.
Well,
Is that helpful to
yeah, I
kind
want
of flesh that out?
Nikki has a question, but just as a response to that, and this goes back to kind of what Carrie was saying, one of the things that concerns me about that is that at no point did the LLM say, actually, that's a terrible path to take, because there's no way that would work because of X, Y, Z. It's designed, like Carrie was saying, to almost always be agreeable, always encourage, and, through its statistical probabilities to kind of allow that your suggestion was a valid research premise to begin with, right? Which I'm not saying it's not.
Sure.
But what if it wasn't? And now you've just spent all this time going down this path that may or may not be helpful. And so I don't know, it's a problem that I definitely can see, like, it's ChatGPT has suggested things to me that I wouldn't have thought of myself that have been useful to me. So I'm not saying that can't happen, but again, like if we evaluate the stakes of like in a research capacity, especially a medical research capacity, how that would go. So
yeah, thank you.
Am I pushing us out?
Go ahead, Nikki.
Okay, and I'm not, this is probably more an answer to a question, and it's maybe, but kind of provocation for tomorrow, I think, right? So Mary asked, what do we need in order to be able to do things, to build systems that might work for our students ourselves? And I think the first thing we need is scholar-owned infrastructure, right? Like we need to not be, we have institutions filled with really smart people, right? There are examples, we have computer scientists, we have librarians whose job it is to say, is this the best way to frame this research question? Right? We have people who can come together to build smaller language models, to trace on the question in the chat, I think, that are open source. We have open source program offices in our institutions, right? That can have models that are built with data that is well documented. We can take examples of stuff from Hugging Face where there are model cards. We can learn from data management practices. How would you describe the origins of these things? We can learn from places like We Play Hosting, who, we started with Virginia Woolf earlier on. They have had for a long time something called domain of one's own. A place for students to have a website that is not commercially owned, right? That they take with them activities. I think if we put our heads together, there's a lot of stuff that's already there, and it does not mean that we need to say, oh, well, let's partner with industry. Or, oh, let's think about how to involve these, but instead think about things that work with our students in the languages they teach that are aligned with the ways they learn. And that maybe we as institutions collaborate in ways that don't need to go beyond the institutions and can actually keep that data and our students sort of self data safe and moving forward. So that's my provocation slash maybe end of today. I don't know.
I think that's a great idea. These are not hard things to build. Yeah, that's right.
I want to talk about this tomorrow, but the challenge with that, and I agree with you. And so I would want to deal with the challenge of that, which is being able to run a software project is a specialized skill set that is not typically part of academia, and it's expensive. And hiring technical people at a nonprofit or academics, I mean, hiring technical people in commercial environments is challenging. And so hiring technical people who can do that work and will, so
That's why we need a consortial approach.
Exactly.
Well, institutions don't want to do it.
Cost sharing, and this came from a conversation with Matthew, who again is not here. When we were talking about this, he said that's actually how they pay for the for athletic associations. They cost share it.
Well, we are well past time at this point, so shall we?
And we have vino.
And we do have.
Apologize, there are 2 bottles only of white wine because I couldn't think of a way to chill it. So if you are a white wine lover, make a beeline, get a nice view.
Pushing people out of the way.
Great. Thank you to our speakers, John, Kyle, and Liz. And thank you to our online audience. And I know that there's a question that we did not get to, but it's noted. Micro language models, there may be more on that to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.